simple view, or at least a first shot, I don't claim this is a final view, desert catering priority. Justice requires whatever choice of action and policy maximizes a function of aggregate well-being that assigns more value to getting a well-being gain for a person. One, the greater the well-being gain, we like more well-being, not less. Two, the higher the person's lifetime deservingness score. And three, the worse off in well-being the person would be over the course of her life absent that benefit. So it can be, all things considered, good to get a benefit to my homeless sister-in-law, Julie, even though she's not going to get much benefit out of it, given how badly off she is over the course of her life. So we might better give the sailboat to Julie, even though she's going to wreck it, but she'll get a little well-being of it, than to Bill Gates, who's a terrific transformer of resource and utility, and even though he has 1,000 sailboats, he'd get a lot of utility out of one extra sailboat. But the moral value of getting a benefit to somebody doesn't just matter how much well-being you get from it, but how badly off your life is going. So, as stated, the doctrine proposes a version of act consequentialism and inherits the pluses and minuses of that doctrine. Some will like it, some will love it. On another occasion, I defend act consequentialism, but I don't think consequentialism versus non-consequentialism is really the issue. It's not the core issue. Let there be some moral constraints, tell the truth, and options. Each person has a personal prerogative, not always to be doing what would bring about absolutely the best outcome. And let these qualify consequentialism. The key claim is that social justice is overwhelmingly morally mandatory beneficence. So we get clear on the right shape of the impartial beneficence principle, we've got justice. It's in the domain of social justice, beneficence, good lives for people, fairly distributed. That's the core imperative, even if it doesn't entirely rule the roost. Right? So you might have some non-consequentialism as constraints and options can enter into the story, and you can still be 95% in agreement here. As an asocial theory of social justice, desert catering priority is aligned with Lockean libertarianism. I've been actually writing about Locke and Nozick lately, and I realize now there's some affinity. The Locke egalitarian, my version, and the Lockean libertarian, people have rights and natural rights, and you should just respect people's rights. Those views are both asocial in the relevant sense against the social interactionist. The Lockean doctrine is also asocial. People have certain natural moral rights, which we ought always respect, and the rights people have are independent of social arrangements, current cultural understandings, conventions, people's subjective attitudes and opinions. Against the social interactionist perspective, the Lockean libertarian and the Locke egalitarian, my version, they're going to be close comrades, even though we might fight on some other issues. Right? So just at the end, going back to recent trends in political philosophy that favor social interactions. I mean, here's just a flavor of the views. One view says, when people are engaged in an ongoing beneficial scheme of cooperation with large consequences for people's lives and functions according to rules and procedures that are de facto binding on all, the requirement that the scheme be justifiable to all participants issues in strong egalitarian principles regulating the distribution of benefits. So it's when we're cooperating in certain ways, then egalitarian principles kick in. In the absence of interaction, one owes only some moral minimum. But when people interact within rule-governed practices, stronger egalitarian duties are triggered. Another version of the idea takes national borders to be significant. When people share membership in a state and hence support a large-scale scheme of coercion of all members that's used to enforce a cooperative scheme, or say a property regime that benefits some more than others, this subjection to coercion for differential benefit stands in need of justification, and the most plausible justification is that this scheme, is justifiable to the person who's worst off, and that roughly is going to take you to maximin or something in that egalitarian family. The massive coercion is also claimed to be a presumptive violation of autonomy. The state massively coerces you. That's a presumptive violation of autonomy, which demands a special justification, which then turns out to be egalitarian justice. But that coercion is within state borders. The state massively coerces insiders, not outsiders, so the duties only apply state by state among the members. A third version of the idea is that when the state both massively coerces those within its borders but not outsiders, but also, not only does that, the state also claims to act in our name. And thus it says, this is the general will. And thus it involves the will of all those who are coerced. And it's that combination of those two things, massive coercion plus the involvement of the will. That's what triggers egalitarian justice. So in response, I'm just going to say a couple things about a couple of the views, and I'll stop you. Very soon. Okay, one minute. So one thing to say about the coercion and autonomy view is I just don't get it. I mean, suppose that suppose it was a question about what we mean by coercion. Just suppose that the state coerces when it issues commands backed by effective sanctions which induce compliance. Now consider, for example, laws against murder. These laws are coercive, but they sit light as a feather on my autonomy if I have no desire, say, to murder my wife. Suppose I developed the unforced desire to murder my wife, and the only thing dissuading me would be the threat of arrest and criminal punishment. Now the state impinges with its coercion massively on my autonomy, but so what? I mean, it seems to me surely its doing so doesn't trigger any special obligation to compensate me for the insult to my autonomy. In other cases, the state enforces laws that shouldn't be on the books. It restricts freedom when it shouldn't. But then the answer is that those laws should not be on the books. So the rough idea would be coercion, it needs a justification, but the justification doesn't have to be special compensation to the person coerced. Now, there could be cases where you're permitted to use coercion, but only if you compensate the person coerced. I think there can be such cases. But I just don't see that the enforcement of a property and contract system, where we enforce one version, we could enforce any of a wide variety of versions, and which one we take will have distributive implications. That needs to be justified. But I don't see it has to be justified especially in terms of how people are doing under this scheme. It might be that the answer to Arneson as to why we have this scheme and why you should pay your taxes is that will support a foreign policy that's good for people in distant, needy strangers elsewhere, right? So I don't see why the special obligations to insiders or flow in the way that the social interaction supposes. The idea that the state both massively coerces and claims to speak in our name, and that triggers a special higher level of justice duties. What I want to say, so I don't think the coercion aspect works, but the claiming to speak in our name, I think that's an important phenomenon, but I think it's latent every time we act. Forget coercion, forget the state, just you and I acting in ordinary life. When one acts, one incurs a latent obligation. What one does should be acceptable according to principles that anybody who is affected or who might be affected by what I do, or for that matter, bystanders, rational agents standing by, what I do should be justifiable to all. In terms of principles we can all accept. It should be, what I do should be rational, justifiable. So the idea that in that sense, anytime I act, I'm involving the will of every other rational agent. I'm calling on that person to say, look, I've got a justification for what I'm doing that you should endorse and that you should accept. So you should go along with what I'm doing. But if that's true in every action, there's nothing special about the state here or state coercion and the involvement of the will. And so, so again, I don't see that there's some. I don't see that the social interactionist is getting the argument for the special emergence of justice principles, given the social interaction, given this account, for the reason just stated. There's also a worry that if these strong notions of what we owe one another, egalitarian justice duties, were dependent on a density of social interaction, they could be avoidable just by avoiding the social interaction, right? I mean, if rich owe poor a lot, the difference principle or something kicks in because of a density of social interaction, then one could always evade the obligation just by withdrawing the interaction. But that seems quite strange, so I can, if I engaged in trade with people in outer Mongolia and they're badly off, I'd owe them something. But then I could avoid the trade and I avoid the, maybe, but that just doesn't seem right to me. But look, this is just introducing a perspective. I'll stop here.